do they need a new reserve currency in BRICS, or there could be something different to get out of these difficulties they're having right now?
The way to understand this question, like most questions, is historical. The problem is we now have, and we have had for about 75 years, a single dominant global currency, and that has been the US dollar. And before that, you had something like it, the British pound, and so on. In the 19th, 18th, and 19th century, you tended to have what we should call colonial currencies. In other words, the British pound or currencies linked to it. Let me give you an example. In England, you had the pound and the shilling. If you went to a colony like Kenya in East Africa, they had the Kenyan pound, and the Kenyan shilling looked like the British one, and it was tied to the British one. So the whole colonial empire worked off of the British currency. And the French did the same thing. You even have today in Western Africa a French currency unit of the African countries. They're now independent, but they hold on to a common currency linked to the French. What we have been seeing, particularly in the 21st century now, is a desire of other countries to get some of the advantages for themselves that used to go to the United States when the dollar was the global currency, and that used to go to Britain when the British Empire had one currency for the whole empire, and so on. So think of it less as an organized change, but more countries saying the world is no longer dominated by the United States economically, just as before it was no longer dominated by the British pound economically, and that you have to adjust for the different world economy as it shifts and changes. So the most important shift of at least the last 50 years, so from the 1970s to the present, that shift has been a relative decline in the dominance of the United States. Number one. Number two, a rise in a specific number of other parts of the world, most importantly, China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries, by and large. Russia is sort of a strange case because they have been pushed out of Europe because of the Soviet Union's socialism, and then because of the hostility of the West wanting to somehow hold on to the Cold War long after it was over. Cold War basically ended in 1989, and here we are, we're still dealing with hostility to Russia, even though it's not the Russia of Lenin or Stalin, it's the Russia of Putin. So think of it, first of all, as a desire of other countries to get into the benefits. What are some of the benefits? The simplest way to understand it is this. If you're a small country, basically the way you can import goods and services, food, clothing, shelter, machinery, whatever, the only way you can import is if you export valuable things that the world wants. So they give you, if you're Brazil, well, not Brazil, if you take, I don't know, Colombia. So you export things from Colombia to Europe, you get euros. You export to the US, you get dollars. You export to Japan, you get yen, and so on. And you use that money that you get, the dollars, the euros, the yen, to buy the things you need to feed your population, to build up your industry, whatever your desires are. The smaller the country, the more you have to import. Now imagine a different situation. You need to import, but you don't anymore need to devote a large part of your population to producing goods for the rest of the world. Why? Why can you do that? Because you're sending them money, pieces of paper that are useless, cost you nothing to produce real in Brazil or pounds in England. But the world wants to hold your currency. The world wants to have a reserve in your currency. The world wants to transact issues around the world with your currency. If that happens, then there's what we call in economics a demand for your currency around the world. Banks will hold your currency to do business. Governments will put into the central bank an amount of your currency to serve your companies as they need it and to have a reserve of something the world recognizes as valuable. That's why today, half of the reserves held by central banks around the world are the US dollar. By some calculations, maybe more, maybe 60%. That's less than what it used to be, 80 or 90%, but it's still a big chunk. And that means that the United States can send to the rest of the world worthless pieces of paper and get in return French wine, Japanese computers, and so forth. It's a fantastic subsidy. It means millions of the workers here in the United States can be put to work producing goods and services for the United States because they don't have to pay for their imports with real goods and services. They can just send the money. Okay, this would be wonderful for poor countries because they could devote their resources to becoming richer. Instead, they have to use their resources to produce goods for export to the richest countries in the world, who they depend on in their export markets because they are the richest people in the world. So there's an example of why any country would like to have its currency be a global currency. Now we have the next example. When the United States sends dollars abroad, okay, now, let's imagine a rich American tourist goes to France and takes with him American dollars, but he cashes them in to stay at fancy hotels and to drink expensive French wine, and blah, 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 all of that. And now the French wine producer takes the dollars paying for the wine he ships to America, and he goes, the wine man, to the central bank, Bank of France, and he has the legal right to exchange the dollars he has for the French francs, which he needs because he pays his French workers in French francs. He buys machinery to process the grapes, etc., etc. So the bank has to maintain dollar reserves because it's winemakers and others come and they either want to give up dollars or if they buy something from the United States, they want dollars. So the bank has to hold big amounts of dollars. That holding the dollar earns them nothing. So what do they do with the dollar? They need to have access to dollars immediate, but they don't want to hold something that generates no income. So here's what they do. They take the reserve currency and they lend it to the United States government. Why? Because they earn interest. The government right now is paying 5%, more or less. Okay, but we're talking about billions of dollars. So earning 5% is an enormous amount of money. They want, and so what they do is they lend to the US government. They buy US treasuries. But if this is another service to the United States, because it means that the United States, for example, I'm going to give you an extreme example, but it's part of the story. The United States is fighting a war against Russia in Ukraine. Okay, everybody knows that that's what this is about. Okay, the United States has to pay for all of the missiles and guns and tanks and everything else that they're sending to Ukraine. How are you going to pay for that? Two choices. Number one, you can tax the American people to raise the money to buy and produce the missiles you're giving to Ukraine. But then you would have to tell the American people, the war we are fighting in Ukraine will cost your family $2,600 next year. That would destroy the support for the war, because Americans they don't know what Ukraine is. They don't care about the Ukraine. They don't care about Russia. You would have a completely different reaction. This has been true for all of the wars fought in the United States since the end of the Second World War. They've all been paid for by borrowing the money to avoid having to go and get taxes. So here comes the irony. China is an ally of Russia, but China is lending to the United States government the money it uses to enable the Ukrainians to kill Russians. You understand? That's how complicated all of this is. And the Chinese don't want to be doing this. The Russians don't like this. But what are the Russians going to do? If they tell the Chinese don't lend to the United States, they are costing the Chinese tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. This the Chinese cannot and will not do. And China is the number 2 lender to the United States. Only Japan has lent more money to the United States. Why? Because Japan, like China, sells a mass of exports to the United States. So they get this they don't buy from the United States. They mostly sell here, a very imbalanced trade. So they're stuck with these dollars, which they then lend. But from the point of view of the United States, this is very convenient, because if you have the money to pay for the Ukraine war without taxing the American people, you will get support for that war. And the more money is lent to you by China, the less you have to find American wealthy people and corporations to lend the money to the government to fight the war in Ukraine. Every other country wants these benefits. The Chinese would like to be able to buy, say, from Germany, because China buys a great deal of machinery from Germany. But the Germans, in turn, buy a lot of stuff from China, so that works. If, however, the Chinese wanted to buy more and more from Germany, but did not want to pay with goods and services produced in China by Chinese, the only way they could do that is if the Germans were willing to hold the dollars to handle the trade and were willing to lend those Chinese yuan back to the Chinese government, because then they would get the benefit that is now taken by the dollar. So again, the big point here is to understand it's not anti-American. That's not what this is about. You could think of it that way because it does take from the United States what the United States was monopolizing for the last 75 years. But the goal is not to hurt the United States. The goal is to get the benefits of having your currency a global currency. Okay, last point. What we are going through in the world now is the adjustment of the world of money to the larger economic changes that are going on in the world. And by that, I mean the relative decline of the United States and its allies, the G7, United States, France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Those countries as an economic force, measured, for example, by their GDP, they have declined in recent years, whereas China and its allies, roughly speaking, the BRICS, are rising. That reality already means that the annual output of goods and services by China and its allies is already larger than the annual output of goods and services by the G7. And so those countries, now that they know how big and powerful they are, they want their currencies, not instead of the US dollar, but alongside the US dollar, to have the benefit of being world currencies. Now, you should know that already the dollar is no longer absolutely dominant the way it was. It's still the single most important world currency, but there are banks around the world that include, alongside the dollar, the euro from Europe, the Japanese yen, and even more recently, the Chinese yuan. So there are already 4 world currencies. So the question for the BRICS is, are they going to try to have the yuan replace the dollar as the dominant world currency? Or are they going to agree among themselves, the BRICS, to produce a new currency, not a national currency, an international currency, which they will all agree to use in place of the dollar, if among themselves? If they do that, then the world will naturally move from the dominance of the dollar to a composite in which the dollar and perhaps the yen and perhaps the euro will coexist with whatever this new multinational currency will be if they establish that. That is a struggle going on inside the BRICS. Some countries want the Chinese yuan to be the new one. Others don't want that and want instead a multinational. And by the way, Europeans are watching this with great concern because they're afraid, for example, that if it were the Chinese yuan, then it would be the US and the yuan, and the euro would disappear or would become much less important than it is now, and that affects all of them. So these are struggles in which banks and national governments and large corporations all have a stake, all have things that could help them or hurt them. And I think that's what's going on here. And remember, there are odd things. It hasn't been decided, for example, whether a country could be both in the G7 and a member of the BRICS. A few months ago, Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France, asked whether he and France could join the BRICS. And the BRICS said, no, thank you, would not let him in. But that would, if they had let him apply, then they would have had to deal with that question in a general way. They haven't done that. So we still don't know whether that might become possible. If Argentina, if the right-wing candidate becomes the next elected leader of Argentina, he has said that he will withdraw Argentina from the BRICS if he's elected. If I understand, he has a good chance of being elected. He may be elected. So we will then have a new phenomena. What happens if a country that's in the BRICS leaves it? And of course, the parallel question, a country in the G7 could leave it. These are all questions. That's why I say we are in the midst of a very important historic transformation. This is like the end of the British Empire and the rise of the American, or like the end of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and so on. Americans are afraid to face this. They're afraid to see it because it is a story of the relative decline of the United States. And if you understand how world politics has gone in the past, the countries with a dominant economic position usually use their economic power to acquire political, cultural, ideological power as well. So if the United States is becoming less of an economic power, it doesn't suggest good things are about to happen to America's ideology, its culture, and its politics. And you can already see the chaotic, bitter, divided politics of the United States is already showing the symptoms of all of this. You know, half this country wants to go with Ukraine against Russia, and the other half wants to go the other way. And that's, if Mr. Trump is elected president again, he may very well go that way. And you would see a very different lineup of countries around the world. So countries are worried, and I mean all countries here, especially those who will say, we're not worried. Those are the most worried of all. They're worried what will happen to France in all of these changes. What will happen to Germany? Intense struggles are going on inside Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, because different industries have a very different, this industry is close to China and wants things to work this way. This industry is close to the United States and wants to keep that relationship. So two different industries inside Italy or inside France or inside Germany are pushing in opposite directions, and the politics of that country will go according to which group of industries is more powerful. Both in the warring industries will each appeal to the masses by telling a story that they hope will make the masses support what they want. But they won't tell the story in terms of help me to be profitable, because the masses are not interested in that. So they'll have to come up with a story. I'll give you an example. If we do this, we won't have all these immigrants. Or if we do this, then there won't be war with this country. Or if we do this, it'll be easier to get development loans in our country, and so on. So you'll have a debate that's really about which way to go in a new divided world, but it will be disguised as something else.